All right, welcome everyone to Twitch Played Pokemon, an analysis of the experimental interactive phenomenon. This talk has been about a year in the making, with about 100 hours of work total, spent observing and talking with players, finding and storing and analyzing data, and basically just talking to people about the impact that this game has had in the past year. I'm Alex Leavitt. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Southern California here in Los Angeles. I work with faculty from both the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, as well as the School for Cinematic Arts, which of course houses the USC Interactive Media and Games program. I'm also a data scientist and user researcher at Sony PlayStation. I work with both San Diego Studio down in San Diego, as well as Sony Santa Monica up here in Los Angeles. I feel like this is not going to be an ordinary GDC talk. There's going to be lots of slides with lots of data, with a split of history, statistics, and especially culture. But I really want to focus on Twitch Plays Pokemon because, and as I will argue, it was probably the most important development in the gaming community this past year. And I think that's epitomized by this image. This is a talk I give at PAX Prime earlier this year, and you can see just how many more people are fans of Twitch Plays Pokemon that might necessarily be interested in hearing about the mechanics or the community behind it. But the fact that Twitch Plays Pokemon garnered such a huge audience, I think is especially important to think about as an industry and what we can learn from it. So first, some quick special thanks. First to Spencer Nelson at Twitch, who was very nice enough to provide me with some data from their servers. Second, Laura Hibbard at the University of Alabama, Huntsville. She helped set up a survey of Twitch Plays Pokemon users during the phenomenon. And then finally, I'd like to thank DERP. I'm a fellow at the Digital Ecologies Research Project. It's a new outfit where we work with a bunch of data providers for various online communities to do research. So let's start at the very beginning. In 1996, when we learned that it was so hard to control Pokemon. So today I'm going to do an intro for what Twitch Plays Pokemon was. I want to look at crowd-based games to understand why Twitch Plays Pokemon was important, and then look at the behavior of participants within the game and in the fan community, and then conclude with some thoughts about the future. Twitch Plays Pokemon was a live game event with a huge audience following and a very large emergent game community that resulted in a very active fan community that produced lots and lots of stuff. Twitch Plays Pokemon as a game might look something like this if you're familiar with it, but if you're not, let's build up to an explanation of what Twitch Plays Pokemon was in pieces. So first, what is Pokemon? Well, Pokemon is a video game published by Nintendo, developed by Game Freak. It was released in 1996 and later in North America in 1998. And notably, it is one of the best-selling video game franchises of all time. If you are not familiar with the original, this is what it looked like on the Nintendo Game Boy system, which of course was a handheld system. It's a basic role-playing game where you walk around a world, you have a monster companion, and then you fight other monster companions to try and catch as many of those monster companions as possible. Now, of course, we can't forget the popularity of the franchise as a whole, especially the original anime series, which is probably more popular in the US than the video game. So second, what is Twitch? This shouldn't be particularly unfamiliar to people, but Twitch is a live streaming service for video game players. So you can go to their website and set up a webcam at your computer, hooked up to a video game on your computer as well, and then you will just stream the game that you are playing, and hopefully garner a bunch of people watching. This is an image from an actual stream, so you have, 1, the game that the person is playing, 2, the player or the streamer themselves, and then finally, and most importantly, 3, the chat. And I'll explain why that's important, of course, in a bit. Finally, what does the term plays necessarily mean? Well, Twitch Plays Pokemon uses an emulator, which, as most of you know, is a program that can replicate game software on your local computer. So you don't necessarily need the hardware. Now, the ingenious part of Twitch Plays Pokemon was the setup that they did. So the cycle of Twitch Plays Pokemon was that they hooked up a server using an emulator of the original Game Boy system, and linked that to the game. Then they linked the game to Twitch's API and chat system so that you could get chat inputs from the chat. Those inputs were then inputted into the game as game commands. So if you type A, then the A command would go into the game. If you type up, then your character would go up in the game. And as the game continued, that would cycle and cycle and cycle endlessly through all the new commands that anyone inputted until the game was beaten. Now you can imagine what might happen, and it might be cute at first, but as we all know, it quickly devolved into total chaos, especially as more and more people decided to play this game. So finally, this is what Twitch Plays Pokemon looked like. It's okay to laugh. And so you can understand how chaotic this game eventually became, especially as more and more and more people started playing it. So I think this slide summarizes the rest of the talk pretty well. You can see here it says, everyone stop typing, let's think. And the rest of the talk, I'll do an analysis of the game's participation, the community, and the implications for future game design. I want to bring in some thoughts about crowds and cooperation and groupthink. So the talk is going to focus on three main discussions. First, what is crowd-based gameplay and design? Second, how you can analyze and harness fan participation from an experiment like this. And then finally, how you can look at an instance of live events and how communities engage with those events. To analyze these things, I draw from a number of different data sources. Chat logs from the game. I worked with a community member who was actively logging the chats in an IRC. Second, surveys taken from players and viewers. There are a number of players who actively did surveys, as well as a few academics as well. I also have server data from twitch.tv. They were nice enough to provide me that. And then finally, log data from Reddit, which was the largest social media platform used by viewers and players of the game. So first, some demographics before we move on. All the survey-related stuff is self-reported, which is important. I'll explain why on one of the slides. First, what is your age? The people who are playing and or viewing are primarily college age. As you can see here, the largest chunk is 18 to 24. What is your gender? As you can see, it skews primarily male. Although, given my background in media, I believe that women were both more likely to watch but also not participate necessarily in a self-selected survey, as well as not necessarily participate on a self-selected survey on Reddit. So that might skew this data point a little bit. If we look at education, again, you can see it's primarily college level. Especially if we look at employment, that just makes that more obvious. Again, it's primarily students. As far as where people were from, we're looking at primarily US, but as far as the other countries, mainly English-speaking. And the takeaway is that we're dealing with a young male, primarily demographic, that has a lot of unstructured time. So let's talk about point one, crowd-based gameplay and game design. How can we understand Twitch Plays Pokemon within the context of its interesting experimental mechanics? So there are a number of crowd-based examples of gameplay that we can look at. For example, Space Team. It's a mobile game where you work with your friends in a space team to operate a ship. While this is a small group game, I think the dynamics of you shouting at each other, not knowing who controls what on each of your panels, replicates the same kind of crowd-based aspects that we'll talk about today. There are some games that we can focus on large groups. So, for example, this is an independently developed game called Renga. I think they showed this at IndieCade a few years ago. And it's 100 people with laser pointers pointing them at a screen with a computer vision algorithm that detects where those points are so that you can defeat enemies or vote on various things. And you can see how chaotic this could possibly be. And crowd-based gameplay isn't necessarily foreign to AAAs either. We have some examples like PlanetSide 2 or EVE Online, where the technology nowadays can scale up gameplay so that thousands and thousands of people who are participating on the same server can all fight in the same battles at the same time. Now, according to Twitch, there were over 1.1 million unique participants that contributed at least one chat message to Twitch Plays Pokemon. What does that collaboration then look like? Well, here's an image from one of the fan forums trying to explain to these million participants what they should do as they get through one area of the game. It's extremely detailed. I am not sure if they were ever able to pull this off. But this is the kind of stuff that you would see from the fan participation as far as trying to embrace this crowd-based behavior. Now, as far as collaboration within the game, there are numerous moments that people encountered where collaboration was a necessity, and they had to try and overcome this crowd-based participation in some form. So, for example, here is the ledge. So the problem is, if you hit down once, you have to restart this all over. And the players of the game spent hours because people would just hit down once, and then they would have to go back and go right and up, and then down once, and then go back and right up. There are also many moments of a lack of collaboration. This is what has been dubbed Bloody Sunday by the community, where basically the game went to the PC, where if you're familiar with Pokemon, you can release Pokemon into the wild so that you no longer own them. Bloody Sunday, of course, is when they went to the PC and released most of their Pokemon, kind of by accident, let's say. Now, as far as people inputting chat commands, looking at the survey, it's fairly evenly distributed across people who contributed a few chats to people who contributed many chats. So the distribution of people is kind of wide-ranging as far as how committed they were to participate in the game. Now, looking at the chat log messages, we have a pretty even distribution with a little bit of data loss here and there. But the sample that I'm working with is over 15 million chat messages, which includes commands as well as various other chats that were put into Twitch's chat interface. You can see that it caps out around 80,000 messages per hour. Here are all of the commands when we break that down. It's a complete mess. But if we wanted to break that out a little bit more, looking at just commands in orange or all the chats in blue, you can see that over time, we start with a fair amount of a fair amount of commands, and then over time the chat increases. To look at that a little bit more, we can look at the relative percentages between those values as well. So again, you can see that the increase in non-command chats over time started around 75% and then increased to 50%. Now, as far as the general participation on a very skewed scale, we can see this very long tail effect where many people only contributed a few times, and a few people contributed many times. So to blow that out with numbers, you can see that about 150,000 users only put in one chat message. About 15,000 people put in 10 chat messages, and about 400 people put in 100 messages each. And that skews all the way down until you have one person putting in 5,000 or 10,000. As far as the chat messages themselves, here's just a distribution of the top 12. Many of which, of course, you can see are commands like A, down, left, B, right. The top two, of course, were related to democracy and anarchy, which was a mechanic that was introduced to the game that allowed players to switch between two modes where you could input every command and they would count, or you would have to wait over a 10-second window and the highest voted command would then count. What's also notable is Start 9, the second one from the bottom, which I'll discuss at the end of the talk. As far as the top contributing players, you can see how much people were committed to actually playing this game. So our top one, Based Helix, has over 17,000 chat messages. We can kind of break this down into a qualitative type of play or understanding. So for example, we have one player, White Ren. This player loved using Anarchy. They, for some reason, use B a lot. And they'll chat occasionally. Thunder XYX also loves Anarchy. And they only decided to use a bunch of different commands. And then finally, FemCatTwitch was really the supreme defender of Anarchy. They used Anarchy so much. For some reason, they used up a lot, and they just kept talking and talking and talking using various chat messages. Now, we don't have to just focus on the top players. We can look at all of them. So another way to look at player behaviors is look at the total number of messages that people did, as well as the total number of unique messages that people did. So, for example, if someone who posted 100 times but only posted 2 messages down and up, they would have a message count of 100, but a unique of only 2. And so we can kind of break these out into a few different types of players. So, for example, first we have the red group, where these are the experimenters. They only post a few messages total. Then we have this green group here. These are the dedicated players. They do lots and lots of the same message over and over again. Then finally, we have this purple, which is the chatters. So they do lots and lots of different messages total. And then we can look at the really crazy people. So we have orange, which are the elite people, tons of the same message, or possibly even spammers who just do the same thing again and again and again. And finally, teal, which I call the crazies. These are people who just do lots and lots of different messages over and over and over again. And just so you can get a temporal look at this, this is just the top 3 players and their logs over time. So over the course of the 2 weeks that TwitchPlaysPokemon occurred for, you can see that some players were very active over the entire course, such as the orange player. Some started right in the middle, like purple and blue. And then there are peaks and valleys depending on levels of activity and interest. So now let's get to point 2, analyzing and harnessing fan participation. So can we understand the motivations and activities of the fan community that organically, and that's important, organically emerged from participating in and around TwitchPlaysPokemon? So we can't obviously ignore the popularity of Pokemon as a franchise. And this was especially key to people who were actively engaged in this game. So as far as familiarity with Pokemon, we can see that many, many people were particularly familiar with Pokemon as a franchise. You can see the 1% sliver not familiar. And then as far as longevity of being familiar, many people were familiar with over 5 years of the franchise, if not more than 10. So next, how are people involved in this fan community? We can ask what fan activities did you participate in? Surprisingly, not many people participated at all as far as doing fan art or writing fan fiction or doing fan discussions. But as we can see in the next slide, it was mainly about viewership of the fan community that people got engaged. In other words, your audience has an audience to themselves. So as far as fan activities that you view, many, many people were interested in things like fan art and fan theories and fan discussions. Fan fiction, not so much, but it was still pretty popular. But you can see here that none, as far as participating, drops from very high to very low for viewership. Now, as I said before at the beginning of the talk, Reddit was primarily the focus for the community. If you don't know, that was on r/TwitchPlaysPokemon. So Reddit is a social news site where many different communities can have their own forum page. And a social news site basically allows anyone to contribute a URL or a text post, and then anyone in the Reddit community can upvote or downvote the particular piece of content. So if you upvote it, you promote it, and then it gains visibility, and if you downvote it, you hide it, and then you get rid of its visibility. So in other words, quote unquote, the community finds particular things important and can make those things visible. Now, as far as people participating on our TwitchPlaysPokemon, there were over 106,000 active subscribers. There were many more participants and many more viewers, of course. So we can look at stats from the subreddit. In February, there were over 2.15 million unique visitors. and over 58.7 million page views. So you can see how popular this fan community really was. Also at the bottom, this includes traffic per day, but you can look at the next slide, which may visualize this a bit easier. So you can see immediately how high everything spikes. Unique visitors by day went up to about 400,000, and by hour up to 35,000. And page views per day were up to 6 million in the initial spike, and by hour up to 200,000 in the initial spike as well, except at the end when it reached about 300,000. Now, as far as the things contributed to this online community, I collected all of the posts and comments. So we're looking at over 40,000 posts and over 358,000 comments. So lots and lots of data to play with. And this is almost 50,000 unique individuals that participated at least one thing. Here's a temporal distribution just to show you the levels of activity over time. So even though we have some data loss from the actual chat messages on Twitch, we can kind of make up for that by looking at what the community itself was interested in talking about. You can see that the biggest spike is around 5 days in, and that was basically when news outlets started picking up on the phenomenon and sending viewers to the subreddit. Now again, we can look at the activity distribution. So again, it's a very long tail effect where few people are participating many times and many people are participating only a few times. And we can throw the numbers on that as well. So you can see that over 23,000 people, again, posted only one contribution. As far as 10 contributions, we're looking at only about 600 people. And 100 or more, we're looking at 10 per number of contributions. Interestingly, the one on the tail end, which is around, I think, 22,000, is just a kind of null value where many people deleted their accounts. So potentially, the numbers that I showed are exponentially more, depending on how many people deleted their content. Now, as far as looking at Reddit as a community, we can do a quick social network analysis. So this is looking at the commenting network, so who commented with other people. So by looking at the connections between what users commented on as far as each other's posts and comments, this graph shows every dot as a user and every line between each dot as a connection as far as one person who commented on someone else's post or comment. And we can zoom into this just to make that a little bit more visible. It's colored and spaced out by modularity clustering, which is just a social network technique to find dense communities. So in other words, people who responded to each other are closer together and similarly colored. And if they didn't respond to anyone, they're farther apart and differently colored. So we can see a couple clusters, such as light blue on the bottom, green at the right, red and orange at the top, and then this big mass of different mishmash colors in the middle. And what this essentially allows us to say is the general takeaway being there are not particularly distinct clusters here, where only certain people might be responding to each other. Instead, we see a rather fairly united community that isn't splintered around particular topics. So many people are responding to each other, so that is a good thing. Now, one of the useful features of Reddit is the voting mechanism. As I said, you can upvote and downvote content, and that allows the community to filter things that they like or don't like. And we can look at what kind of content was preferred and was not based on those up and down indexes. So probably the most important things are, one, this red, which are things that are highly downvoted and not so upvoted. So just looking at the content myself on a qualitative level, these are things that are very spammy and trolly, things that are irrelevant to discussion, people complaining about things, maybe trying to make a joke and totally failing. And then this green area up here, things that are highly voted and not so downvoted. These are things that people find fascinating. Things like updates, very funny jokes, various discussions that inspire lots of comments, and celebratory images for when events happen and then people want to talk about them and celebrate. But outside of the activity, what could we say is the TwitchPlaysPokemon fandom? Or what is the TwitchPlaysPokemon community? Well, by looking at the types of content that was contributed, we can kind of get a better sense. So as far as the types of posts, we can break it out into textual posts in red, different types of images in orange, YouTube links, and a bunch of other stuff, which comprises animated GIFs to other image uploading sites, to strategy mockups, to reaction images, to screenshots. But what's important is that many people use this space as a discussion space. They wanted to connect to other players. As far as the 50 most commented posts, we can look at it on a qualitative level to see what they were. So there's a fairly even split between update threads, where viewers were kept on track with what was happening just because it's hard to sit in front of the computer watching the game all day. Many images, such as screenshots and good fan art, were highly upvoted and highly commented upon. We had a bunch of discussions, so people were interested in what was going on, but also what people felt was good and bad about the game. And then, of course, new ideas. So what should people do in the game to progress? And people wanted to talk about that. The top commented posts had over 19,000 comments. And notably, the top 13 most commented posts were all update threads, which makes sense because, as I'll say later, this was mainly a viewership rather than a participation community. People were very interested to see how this experiment would work. We can also look at it on a linguistic level. So here is just the top one-word occurrences within the Reddit community. So here we see things like democracy and anarchy, like before when I talked about the implementation of that mechanic. We see things like Helix, or this very popular, not quite a character that became an aspect of the community's religion, quote unquote. We see things like people in Pokemon trying to deal with the mechanics of the crowd implemented in the game. We see words like just in time, so people reacting to events just as they happen. And finally, things like and don't, so reactions to people that people appreciate or not. We can also look at the co-occurrence of words. So here we see a slightly different take on what was popular. We see many different things, such as characters, like Bird Jesus or Lord Helix, things that were very popular to the community. Particular locations that were pivotal in the game, such as the Safari Zone or Victory Road. Again, we see the anarchy-democracy mechanic being talked about a lot. There are various shared celebrations and jokes and memes, such as Praise Helix. And finally, this interesting don't think. So there's a lot of discussion that really revolves around disagreement and trying to suss out what the community should be doing. And next, I'll show this temporally over time so we can look at various trends and how we can pull those out of this kind of data. So just looking at keywords over time, I think this particular question is interesting. So here, I was interested in how the community identified with each other. So here in orange, we have the word we, and in blue, we have the term I. So you can see that over time, increasingly, we saw we as a unifier of the discussions. Next, we could look at the various characters that were popular. So we can see spikes and mentions of different characters to see exactly when they were particularly important to that part of the game. So here in brown, which is that first big spike on the left, we see Eevee around February 17th. In red was Abby, which was a Charmander, which evolved later. Then we have various other characters, and that big spike on the right in purple is a Venomoth, which kind of accidentally beat the Elite Four at the very end. If we wanted to look at the chat mechanics, again, when I talked about democracy and anarchy, we can also pull those out too. The biggest spike, of course, was around February 18th or 19th, when they first implemented it and people were reacting to it in a negative way. And note, discuss just as much as each other. So even though it was a very contentious topic, people made sure that they had a balanced discussion about it. We can also look at conversations about trolling and frustration, which is a particularly salient point in this community. So here we have Riot in green, Start9 in red, and trolling in blue. So riots and Start9, which was a way to basically react to the implementation of the democracy mechanic, occurred mainly just after they had implemented it. We can also look at various big game-related controversies. So before I mentioned the kind of failure of collaboration around the ledge, which is here in green. And then we can also look at accessing the PC and Bloody Sunday, which is here in purple. And finally, we can just see the various reactions that people had around this kind of religious following in the very active fandom. So here in blue, we have Helix, and red in Dome, or Dome in red. And you can see here that, of course, Helix was much more popular for the fandom. And at the very end, you see this giant spike when the game was beaten, which, of course, is people saying praise Helix, because they are celebrating that the game was actually successful. Now, one final thing that we can look at, too, is fan productions. So here are the top 50 highest voted posts. And obviously, what's very evident is that images and GIFs were particularly popular for the highest voted content. So unlike highest commented before, where we saw a very even distribution of different types of participation, here it's all about celebrating. Now, it's important to talk about the role of fan art in this community. The community was very active, and even though before we saw that many people didn't necessarily participate in it, it still became something that many people wanted to look at. Some of the fan art is extremely detailed, but it's important to note that the role of fan art can also help catalog these events as they occur. So we can use many of these pieces of fan art to see what was popular over time and what really stuck with the community members. As far as various shared images, there are different types that were shared. So for example, remixed images, mainly with pop culture references. Reaction images is also a particularly important viewership behavior where people kind of come together to react to the live event as it's occurring. My favorite image is this one in the top right, because it's totally evident of, of what is going on. And then finally, we also have traditional fan celebrations. So people just making good fan art that people can celebrate and share together. So finally, let's end with point 3, looking at live events and community engagement. So one question I could ask was Twitch Plays Pokemon an esport? And what can we learn from engaging viewers around a live event-based game? So to note first, they did finish the game in just over 16 days. So congrats to Twitch Plays Pokemon as an experiment. As I've said before, cataloging and documentation was a very important facet of participating as a viewer in the community. And probably more so, relying on more dedicated fans to record all that information. Because again, you're not going to just sit in front of the computer for 16 days straight just watching people fail and fail and fail. You want to know the various events that happened and why they were important and when. The phenomenon of shared moments was really key to how word of mouth spread. And people would catalog these events as they went through. There are a number of shared moments that people really came around that kind of made Twitch Plays Pokemon a very interesting community just because of the chaos that occurred. So here is one. This is the renaming of a Pokemon which eventually got the nickname Bird Jesus because of the name that was chosen, as you can see here. That is a better name than before. And then finally, here's another example where they beat Lieutenant Surge, who is one of the bosses in the game, using Bird Jesus to take down one of the Pokemon. So they eventually win. Made a mistake, it was Abby, not Bird Jesus. Okay, so next, how did people even get involved in Twitch Plays Pokemon in the first place? Asking about how people heard about the game, we can see that social media was a huge factor, and of course other bits of word of mouth, especially people just talking to friends on a day-to-day basis. As far as what day particular people started on, I have 2 graphs to show about that. So this first one was taken on day 8, about halfway through the game. And so for these early adopters, even though we saw attention spiked around day 5 earlier, For the early adopters, many of them started around day 2 or 3. So it didn't take very long for people to get interested in this game. Now, taken after the game ended, we also asked when did people join TwitchPlaysPokemon? And most of the people fell into week 1, which again makes sense because the spike due to the popularity of people covering the game was on day 5. So next, what were people even interested in as far as participating? So we asked, what was your favorite thing about TwitchPlaysPokemon? And probably interestingly, many people were particularly inspired by the chaos. Fan art, of course, was the second most one, and as we saw before, many people were interested in looking at that stuff. But also, intriguingly less so, many people were not, as their first choice, necessarily interested in seeing the game progress. As far as how people participated, we asked what best described your participation. So most people would watch the stream, but input few commands. The second highest was watching the stream without any commands. So again, the focus on TwitchPlaysPokemon as a phenomenon isn't necessarily about people participating in this experimental game, more so as people participating in it as a viewership phenomenon. As far as how often people watch TwitchPlaysPokemon, it's fairly even all around, though we have at least one time per day for the majority of the people. So everyone essentially wants to check in to see what's going on and maybe have a chance encounter with something that happened that was interesting. And this is how I participated and how I first got interested, just checking in a few times a day saying, oh, what's happening? Nothing. OK, I'll check back later. As far as a temporal phenomenon, we can see that many people tended to watch in the late afternoon or early evening or at home at night. And as far as the type of content that people were interested in watching, people either cared about watching particular events or they cared about just tuning in whenever they could. So not many people wanted to check in all the time, routinely, or just a number didn't bother really watching at all. They just kind of checked the update threads in the community. As far as our viewership, we had over 9 million unique viewers. So this is actually more than some live sports events, like the Stanley Cup Finals, which is for hockey. As far as total views, there were over 36 million. And according to Twitch, there were over 1 billion minutes watched for this game. And viewership, again, dominated other games in the video game space while TwitchPlaysPokemon was occurring. So here's a screenshot from Twitch's homepage, where you can see that TwitchPlaysPokemon eclipsed even League of Legends, which is kind of a notable badge of honor. We can even look at the stats of TwitchPlaysPokemon in comparison to these other various games and users on Twitch. So here in blue, we have the global Twitch viewership versus orange TwitchPlaysPokemon. And you can see that at one point, TwitchPlaysPokemon accounted for about 20% of the total viewership on Twitch, which is pretty crazy. Looking specifically at TwitchPlaysPokemon as a channel, here we have orange for the USA and Great Britain in green, so the two most active countries. And you can see, essentially, it's a very temporal graph with peaks and valleys, just as people are waking up and watching at night and not in the morning. And then we, of course, see a spike when the first generation ends, and popularity continues to fall off. One thing I didn't mention at the beginning is that the channel continued to play Pokemon games. They went through the entire franchise, which is over a dozen or so games. But TwitchPlaysPokemon, the very first one, was the most notable, really, and I think the thing that most of the people in the industry have paid attention to since. Now, returning to an earlier slide, I had mentioned two things. Looking at the game mechanics that were, the game commands that were popular, there were two things to pull out. To look specifically at issues that were relevant to the community. So these two things are the democracy and anarchy game mechanic, and then the Start 9 trolling behavior. And these are things that I think are especially relevant to people who are interested in experimenting with these types of communities and these types of live events. So first, one of the survey questions was, what is your favorite mode? And anarchy won out pretty much entirely. As I said earlier, anarchy essentially allowed people to input any command, and that command would essentially be inputted into the game automatically. However, if people voted for democracy, which required a 75% majority vote in order to push it into that mode, when democracy happened, you would have a 10-second window in order to input the highest command, and then that command would be chosen. So it allowed people to essentially go through the game by making much better choices so that people could work together and overcome these places where they got stuck. And this was a choice on the part of the designer of TwitchPlaysPokemon. But people clearly preferred the randomness and chaos. It was essentially key to the game experience. Now, as far as the number of chat messages, we can also look at that temporally over time. So here you can see that they were constantly competing after their implementation a few days into the game. One thing that we can look at is, besides the top 12 chat messages, what are the next 10? And these tell us a little bit more about what people were using the chat for. So the next highest comment was lol. Also, we see things like wait and yes. So all of these are reactions to live events. And in the last top messages list, we saw start 9. And here we also see things like riot and kappa. So let me talk about those real quick. So after the democracy and anarchy mechanic was implemented in the game, many people flipped out. So one way to express their rage was to implement start 9. So as far as democracy worked as a mechanic, you could input a command and then a number afterwards, and it would do it that many times. So of course you could see that by pressing start, it would pull up a menu in Pokemon, and that would essentially pause the game. But by doing that 9 times, over and over and over again, that would completely eliminate any progress whatsoever. Here's a quick video explaining how exactly this played out. So you get a sense of how this could completely ruin the game experience. So riot became a clear indicator by viewers that they were displeased. And there are a number of spikes that occur as we see this debate between anarchy and democracy over time. So here riot's in green. You can see as soon as they implemented the system, there was a riot, and then a few days later there was a similar one as well. I mentioned kappa as a very popular command earlier. For those who are not well-versed in Twitch lingo, kappa is a Twitch-specific emoticon. It's actually fashioned after a former developer's face. But it's basically known nowadays as a troll face marker of sorts. So people will post kappa to be very sarcastic or just kind of mess up the chat a little bit. So as I said before, this type of trolling behavior was particularly salient to the community as an issue that they wanted to overcome. So just looking at how the TwitchPlaysPokemon community could be improved, I think there are 2 things to take away. One is trolling as the most important thing that people felt, and then also toxicity as a very important behavior. And I think that this is something that future experimental games in this genre of viewer participation can focus on to improve the player and the viewer experience, both of them. We can also, if we wanted to, look at player behavior to find those trolls. There are not many, but they do matter to the player experience. So here we have a total count of messages on the x-axis, and a ratio of how many messages were troll comments, like start 9 and stuff like that. And here, I call the troll threshold. So these are people who just comment much too often than normal in a sort of trollish way. And you should also pay attention to the community as they engage with these issues. Here's a quick screenshot showing how bots became a very particular issue that possibly ruined the player experience because all of these bots were identified as promoting democracy, when maybe the player base didn't necessarily care about that. So where does this leave us, and where can we muse on for the future? Well, first, we talked about experimental games and mechanics. And I feel that changes in experimental game mechanics will really start to influence, especially independent games in the future. So here are two games, Choice Chamber and Epsilon Circuit, that are integrating Twitch chat into their game experiences. One of the important things that one of the developers from Epsilon Circuit said was that everything you do is automatically being streamed, but it's a necessary back and forth between the player and the audience members. So everything that you do becomes a collaborative effort between the player and the spectator. Polygon specifically pointed out that the popularity of social experiments like TwitchPlaysPokemon might suggest that Twitch as a broadcasting service could actually evolve into its own game platform. And from many people that I've seen talk about TwitchPlaysPokemon, it seems like the industry is definitely interested in how they can use Twitch, especially with its recent acquisition by Amazon, to really push forward game communities in the future, both to engage them on a consumer level, but also on a player level. Second, how can we possibly use data to study and improve the player and audience experience? VentureBeat had an interesting interview with Kevin Lin, who is the chief operating officer at Twitch. And he said that essentially Twitch has created its own genre, and it's unforgettable that this could happen really only on Twitch, given its particular infrastructure. So the availability of open APIs could definitely redefine the experience of live gaming and live player experiences. And then finally, how are communities involved as audiences? How can we change what it means to be a viewer in the future of games? And I think that viewership is especially an important aspect of that because esports and just systems like YouTube are becoming so prominent now in players' experiences of games, when in earlier years that might just be a walkthrough or a Nintendo magazine. Here's an example from the MIT Media Lab. Drew Harry, who was a PhD student there, who's now actually at Twitch, created this interface where it amplifies certain aspects of a chat stream in a StarCraft 2 match so that you can understand what kind of things the audience is interested in for the players themselves. And also at a panel yesterday, which focused on the role of the modding community in contributing to better esports interfaces, we saw that broadcasting and viewer enjoyment really relied on companies embracing these new modifications. So that's all I have for today. I hope this was an interesting exploration of both the history but also cultural impact of TwitchPlaysPokemon. And if anyone has questions, we have a little bit of time for that. So thank you very much for coming, and make sure to fill out your evaluation. Thanks. So if you have a question, I've been asked to go to the mic so that they can record it. Also, if you don't mind, state your name and affiliation.
Hi, Michael Bellavia, CEO of Animax, a game development shop. The stats that you're showing as far as like the user demographics inside of this thing, how did that correlate to the Twitch population itself, to Pokemon population that is engaging with this thing now, even though it's far beyond the years when it was at its prime? And I'm just curious how you extrapolate this information to other things. It just happened, it was Pokemon. Would the same results have been if this was like Twitch plays Candy Crush, or Twitch watches as the world turns, or whatever?
Yeah, so the two questions were how the demographics of TwitchPlaysPokemon align with things like the demographics of Pokemon in general, or of Twitch in general. And then also, I totally forgot the second question already. Right, so basically the generalizability of Twitch Plays Pokemon to other games? The first one, I'm not necessarily sure I can answer. I actually talked to Twitch about getting demographic information, but because it's private information, they were a bit hesitant to share. But as we know, I think that Twitch Plays Pokemon, as I showed, has a very young and male demographic. Twitch tends to have a similar demographic, and Pokemon in general has a very wide-reaching international audience that both spans a fairly even male-female divide. What I think is especially important, though, is this kind of aspect of kind of like historicity to Pokemon, so that people are just so involved in the franchise now, and it's so common that immediately brings this kind of nostalgia to an experiment like this. So I would agree with the assumption that you made in that maybe this isn't necessarily generalizable to other games. I think this became such a phenomenon because people knew what Pokemon was. It was a simple game, and people understood the mechanics and storyline and what the initial goals were. The games that I showed earlier at the very end, I think, are doing these interesting experiments, but because they don't necessarily have that nostalgia behind their franchises, since obviously they're new, that will definitely hamper them. But I'd applaud them for at least trying out these new mechanics. I know it's something that many industry veterans have tried to push at events like GDC, like Ralph Koster yesterday, talking about creativity and being able to move beyond the repetitiveness in these kind of games that we see nowadays. So yeah, Again, I feel like that Twitch Plays Pokemon is definitely exceptional, and it might be hard to say that you can take everything that I showed today and immediately apply it to your own games. But I think that there are definitely trends, such as looking at how audiences react to live events, looking at how these communities emerge and what they're interested in, that you could apply to games, whether they have very large audiences or very small ones.
Hi, I'm Henry Teal from Neon and Phoenix Entertainment. I was actually wondering, because I recall seeing that they were starting up the second generation of Twitch Plays Pokemon. I wasn't only paying attention to the stuff on Imager at the time anyway. And then I saw almost like a week later, I think, that they actually beat the second game, which was a much shorter time period than the first game. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, well, I didn't have any data on the other games. The channel that hosted Twitch Plays Pokemon did actually go through all the games. And the question focused on, well, why did they do it so much more quickly for the other games? And I think the key is that interest basically dropped off after they beat the first one, and the core audiences really did stick around for the other ones. One thing that I noticed looking at the subreddit, since I have been actively tracking how players are reacting to the new games and just seeing if there are different behaviors, there is definitely a much more dense collaboration now between the various players that participate. So instead of seeing, say, 600,000 people all participating at once, we're down to the tens of thousands, if not lower than that. So because you're basically collapsing this crazy crowd mechanic that really does bring the chaos, it's much more easier to move through it in a less chaotic and more organized manner. Yeah, if you don't mind.
Actually, a second question on that is, what were you thinking the chances of Twitch Plays Pokemon actually completing the game successfully?
So the question was just, what were the chances that this game were successful at the very beginning? And I think that's something that many people were interested in and why it became so popular. For me, I didn't really have an estimate, I guess. I was just wondering if it was even possible for so many people to coordinate. And as we saw, it took them a while, but at the end of the day, it was able to kind of play out. One interesting thing that I've been trying to find in the data, it's a bit difficult just because it's so chaotic, is just at certain times, how much farther were they able to get? One of the kind of anecdotes from the community is that many of the major milestones happened when all the Americans were asleep and all the Australians were awake. So they were able to coordinate with many less people. And I wouldn't honestly be surprised if that was true, because at the peak times, you saw many people just kind of throwing chat messages in and seeing nothing get done. And that would happen for hours and hours and hours until people started leaving the chat, and then a little bit of progress would get made. Are we over time? Did I see a signal about that? Or do we have time for one more question? Okay, so we have one more question.
All right. My name is Elliot. I'm a grad student at USC. I'm wondering what your thoughts on was this got started in the first place. Because, yeah, it went viral and it exploded and stuff, but, like, the very beginnings, was the creator, like, actively marketing it, or was it just showing it to a few people and it exploded?
Yeah, so I think it really was an organic, emergent phenomenon. We see nowadays that many things that get popular on Reddit and Twitter really do spread word very quickly, and that happened here. So an anonymous programmer from Australia did make the game. He set it up on a server, put it on Twitch, and kind of spread it out to a couple of friends and gamers. And then once it caught on, more and more news spread. And as I showed in the graphs earlier, once day 5 hit and all the news agencies brought attention to it, that's when the huge wave of people came in and really did kind of make it a phenomenon. The subreddit for Twitch Plays Pokemon was set up basically just after the game had been launched. And we see that there is a pretty significant trend as far as not many people participating at first. And then once day 3 or 4 occurs, an explosion of popularity. So I think that we can pretty much say that this is a fairly emergent and organic phenomenon. But it's a bit hard to say exactly what were the ties between people that led that initial wave or the seed to kind of bloom into the flower that it became. Okay, so I think we're done. Thank you very much for coming again, and evaluations. So thanks.